I am 74 years old, and in recent years I have become something like a ghost in my own life, a man who moves quietly through rooms that echo with silence, who eats at a small kitchen table surrounded by empty chairs, who goes to sleep with the radio murmuring softly, only to have something that resembles a human voice nearby. When people pass me on the street, they might see an elderly man in a faded coat, with grey hair that refuses to stay neat, but they do not know how much weight a man carries when his family has turned its back on him for decades. My name is Leonard, though almost nobody uses it anymore. For the last 20 years, since the day my son Michael stopped talking to me, I have been called only by neighbours or by the clerks at the grocery store who address me as Sir. The word Dad has not been spoken to me in 2 decades, not in truth, and not with sincerity. It is a title that once meant everything, and now it hangs in the air like something from a dream that refuses to come back. I worked nearly all my life at the assembly plant just outside Topeka, Kansas, building farm equipment. It was not glamorous work, and the pay was never extraordinary, but it was honest, and I never once in my life shirked a shift or took a dishonest penny. I remember my hands being younger, calloused but strong, and how I believed that if I worked steadily enough, if I saved carefully, my family would always have the security I never knew as a boy. My wife Ellen was the one who kept warmth in the house, who taught me how to smile after long days when my back ached. We raised Michael under that roof, watched him learn to ride a bike in the cracked driveway, listened to him slam doors as a teenager when he was angry, and stood at his high school graduation with pride, even though the sun burned mercilessly that afternoon. For a long time, I believed that all of it, the work and the patience and the sacrifices, were leading to something like the picture I used to carry in my mind. Christmas dinners around a crowded table, grandchildren running in the hallway, Michael calling me on Sundays just to ask if I had eaten. That picture has long since faded. The truth is that Michael left my life over something as ugly as money. When my own mother died, she left a modest inheritance, nothing spectacular, just enough to be divided between myself and my sister, with a small portion set aside for Michael's future. At the time, he was in his 30s, already married, already building his own life. I thought he would understand that the money was not limitless, that it came from years of my mother's thrift and careful saving. But he wanted more, demanded that I sign over nearly everything to him. When I refused, not out of malice but out of duty to my sister and to the fairness of my mother's wishes, he exploded with a rage I had never seen in him before. He said words that pierced me like knives, called me selfish, accused me of never caring for him, and swore he would have nothing to do with me again. I thought it was only an outburst, that time would cool his anger, but weeks turned to months, months to years, and silence grew like mold between us. Eventually 2 decades passed, and the distance hardened into something like stone. Since Ellen died 12 years ago, my life has been lived mostly in quiet routines. I rise early, even though I have nowhere important to be, make coffee in the dented old percolator, fry 2 eggs if I have the appetite, and sit by the window to watch the street while the newspaper lies unopened beside me. Sometimes I attempt the crossword, but more often I let the pages sit untouched because the words remind me of conversations I no longer have with anyone. Afternoons are filled with small chores that do not really matter. Dusting shelves, polishing the same old photographs, sweeping the walkway though no one visits. In the evenings, I heat canned soup or bake a potato, then sit in front of the small television where the same shows seem to repeat endlessly. I talk sometimes to Ellen's picture. Not out loud, not with madness, but with a whisper inside my head, telling her how much quieter the house has become, how Michael has never once come back, how even Christmas passes without a single knock on the door. Neighbors occasionally wave. A woman named Ruth from across the street sometimes brings me cookies around Thanksgiving, but she has her own family, her grandchildren who come running up her porch with laughter, and when I watch them through the window, I feel both joy and an "Ack so heavy I must sit down." It is not envy. Not exactly. It is more the reminder that somewhere in the same city my own grandchildren have grown up without knowing my voice or my stories. I have seen pictures of them only once, years ago, by accident, when a mutual acquaintance showed me a holiday card that Michael's wife had mailed to her church group. They looked like strangers, smiling faces of children who would not recognize me if I stood in front of them. To know that your own blood walks the same earth, and yet is forbidden from you, is a punishment I would not wish on anyone. Over the years, I learned to carry this estrangement as one carries an invisible weight. I stopped expecting the phone to ring on Father's Day. I stopped waiting by the mailbox in December for a Christmas card. I forced myself not to linger too long on the memories of Michael as a boy, though they return uninvited at odd hours. The sound of his small shoes tapping the kitchen floor, his laughter when I swung him in the yard, his shy questions about the world, when he thought his mother was not listening. Those memories are both gifts and torments. They remind me that there was once love, and they remind me of how utterly it can be withdrawn. In the long, quiet years, I accepted the idea that I would die without reconciliation, that whatever chance there had been to heal the wound was lost to time. The house reflects this reality. There are rooms I no longer enter because they feel too large for one man. The dining table that once seated 6 now holds only my newspaper and sometimes a vase of artificial flowers that never wilt but also never smell like life. Upstairs, Michael's old room still exists with a baseball glove in the closet and a faded poster on the wall, but I keep the door closed because entering it is like tearing open a scar. Even the holiday decorations remain in boxes in the attic. I have not put up a Christmas tree since Ellen's last year because decorating for no one feels like mocking myself. The radio, with its soft hum and occasional crackle, is the only company I allow, and sometimes when the announcer's voice fades between stations, I close my eyes and imagine it is the sound of another human being speaking to me. What keeps a man alive in such solitude is not always hope, but habit. Habit has been my anchor. I know exactly how many steps it takes to walk from my bedroom to the kitchen, exactly which floorboard will creak when I carry laundry to the basement, exactly how long the kettle takes to whistle. It is a life reduced to small measures, and though it lacks joy, it carries a certain steadiness. And yet beneath that steadiness lies a current of longing I cannot extinguish. A man can claim he is used to loneliness, but no one is truly immune to the hunger for family. I may have told myself for years that I no longer cared whether Michael remembered me. But late at night, when the wind rattles the windows, I know that if the phone were ever to ring with his voice, I would answer before the first chime ended. The turning point of my otherwise monotonous existence arrived not with a grand announcement or a lightning strike, but with the simple scratching sound of a pen and the folding of a paper slip in my local gas station. I had stopped there, as I often did on Saturday mornings, more out of habit than necessity, to buy a cup of weak coffee and exchange a few words with the cashier, a young woman who never remembered my name, but always smiled politely. On that particular morning, something caught my eye behind the counter. A stack of colourful lottery tickets, half covered by a display of candy bars. For reasons I could not entirely explain, perhaps out of boredom or perhaps out of the faint thrill that comes with breaking routine, I slid a dollar bill across the counter and asked for one. It was not the first time in my life I had done this, but it was the first time in decades. I had long considered gambling a foolish pastime, especially after years of watching co-workers waste their paychecks chasing luck. But there was something in the air that day, a kind of restless impulse, and I gave in to it without expectation. I carried the ticket home tucked into my wallet, nearly forgetting about it until late that evening when the television announcer began reading out numbers during the state lottery broadcast. I sat in my worn armchair with the volume turned low, not really listening, half asleep, until the sequence of digits reached me in a strange echo, as though the announcer were speaking directly into my chest. I fumbled for my wallet, unfolded the slip, and read the first number, then the second, and then the third. My pulse quickened. By the time the last number matched, I was gripping the ticket so tightly my knuckles whitened. At first I thought there must be a mistake. My eyes, weak with age, surely misread the digits. But after checking and rechecking, it became undeniable. I had won. Not a few $100s, not even a modest sum, but the full jackpot. An amount so vast compared to my modest savings that I sat in disbelief, staring at the screen until it faded into commercials. For days afterward, I moved through my routines with a surreal sense of dislocation. At the grocery store, as I placed cans of soup and bread on the conveyor belt, I kept thinking to myself that I could purchase the entire store if I wanted. As I walked through my quiet neighborhood, I imagined that I could buy every house on the block, though none of that truly appealed to me. It was not greed that took hold of me, but rather a strange awareness that my life, so rigidly defined by scarcity and discipline, had shifted overnight into something unrecognizable. The lottery office confirmed the ticket's validity, and after the mandatory procedures and consultations with lawyers and financial advisors, I found myself with a bank account swollen by nearly $1 million, an amount I had never even allowed myself to dream of possessing. At first I told no one. There was no one to tell, or so I believed. I resolved to live as I always had, cautiously and quietly, perhaps repairing the roof or replacing the old furnace, perhaps buying a new coat to guard against the Kansas winters. But wealth, like a scent, has a way of traveling beyond locked doors, and though I never spoke of it aloud, whispers began to circulate. The teller at the bank, the lawyer who advised me on taxes, even the clerk who handed me the cashier's check. All of them lived in the same town where secrets rarely stay hidden. It was not long before the story reached ears I had never expected to hear from again. The telephone rang one Thursday afternoon as I was folding laundry, a sound so rare in my house that it startled me. I almost did not pick up, convinced it was a wrong number. When I did, I froze at the voice that greeted me. Dad. The word was spoken cautiously, almost awkwardly, as though the tongue that formed it had forgotten the shape after years of disuse. My heart pounded so hard I had to grip the edge of the table for balance. It was Michael. The son who had not spoken to me in 2 decades, whose absence had grown into a kind of permanent shadow, was suddenly on the other end of the line. For a moment I could not form words. My throat tightened, and a dozen emotions collided within me: joy, suspicion, longing, fear. Finally I managed a hoarse reply. Michael, is it really you? His voice, deeper and more assertive than I remembered, carried a strange brightness. He spoke of the years that had passed, glossing over them as though they were nothing more than a season that had drifted by. He mentioned his children, now grown, whom I had never seen except in that single photograph long ago. Then, without much preamble, he extended an invitation. Christmas, he said, would be the perfect time for us to be together again. His wife was preparing a large dinner. The children would be home from college, and it would mean so much to have me there. He emphasized the word family, rolling it out like a balm over old wounds. As he spoke, my heart wrestled with itself. Part of me longed to believe that time had softened him, that regret had brought him back to me. But another part, sharper and less forgiving, whispered the truth I did not want to face: that the timing of his sudden reconciliation was no coincidence. The whispers of my lottery win must have reached him, and now, after 20 years of silence, he remembered he had a father. Yet even as suspicion gnawed at me, I felt the weight of loneliness pressing harder. The prospect of sitting at a table with family, of hearing voices in my home again, of not being invisible on Christmas Day, all tempted me toward acceptance. I agreed, my voice trembling as I said I would come. He sounded almost triumphant, though he disguised it with warmth. After the call ended, I sat in the stillness of my house, staring at the receiver in my hand. I wanted to weep, though I could not decide whether it was from happiness or dread. For 20 years I had prepared myself for the possibility that reconciliation would never come, and now it appeared suddenly, almost suspiciously, just as my circumstances changed. Yet, despite the doubts that clung to me, I found myself already imagining the drive to his house, the sound of my grandchildren's laughter, the aroma of Christmas dinner filling the air. I told myself it was a second chance, even as a voice deep inside insisted it was something else entirely. The weeks leading up to Christmas moved strangely for me, filled with a nervous energy I had not felt in years, as though I were preparing for some kind of performance rather than a simple family gathering. I bought a new coat, not extravagant but warm and respectable, telling myself it would keep me presentable among relatives I had not seen in decades. I spent long hours pacing the house, rehearsing in my mind what I might say to Michael, how I might greet the grandchildren, whether I should attempt an apology for the years of silence, even though I had not been the one to sever the bond. I imagined Ellen standing beside me, whispering that I should be patient, that I should take what was offered even if it came too late. Yet every time I tried to picture a joyful reunion, there was a hollow place in my chest that refused to be filled, a nagging suspicion that the sudden invitation was too neatly aligned with my change of fortune to be mere coincidence. Still, hope is a stubborn thing in the heart of a lonely man, and by the time the morning of Christmas Eve arrived, I found myself driving with trembling hands toward my son's home, carrying a bottle of wine and a tin of cookies as peace offerings, my pulse hammering with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Michael's house was larger than I expected, a broad suburban home with 2 stories, a wreath on the door, and lights strung neatly along the roofline. It radiated a kind of affluence that surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. After all, 20 years is a long time in which to build one's fortune. Still, there was something in the sharpness of its presentation, the polished driveway with 2 late-model cars gleaming in the cold air, that made me feel small before I even stepped inside. I rang the doorbell and waited, clutching the tin in my hand, rehearsing my smile. When the door opened, Michael stood there in a sweater that looked expensive, his hair graying but still thick, his face more lined than I remembered, yet still carrying that same resolute jaw that once turned stubborn against me. He greeted me with a hug that felt more staged than sincere, firm but slightly too brisk, as if a camera were recording it somewhere behind me. Inside, the house smelled of roasted meat and cinnamon, a feast in preparation, and voices drifted from the kitchen where his wife, Linda, offered me a polite smile, but no embrace, her eyes scanning me as though to measure how frail I had become. My grandchildren, taller than I expected, stood awkwardly at first, introduced with quick words as though I were a guest rather than their grandfather, and while one offered a handshake, the other simply nodded before disappearing toward the living room. I tried not to let the coldness pierce me, but it was there, just beneath the veneer of hospitality. We sat together, exchanging formal words, Michael asking about my health, in a tone that seemed more like an evaluation than genuine concern. He repeated questions, asking whether I had been managing bills, whether the house was too much for me alone, whether I had thought of selling and moving somewhere smaller, questions that might have been reasonable in any other context, but which now carried a faintly predatory edge, as though he were probing not my well-being, but my financial landscape. At dinner, the conversation turned oddly toward inheritance and aging, not in blunt terms, but in veiled suggestions that hovered just above the surface. Michael recounted how difficult it had been to manage Linda's father's estate when he passed, how chaotic it became without clear instructions, how important it was for families to plan ahead. Linda nodded, and added that it was always best for the elderly to decide early who would manage their affairs in case of decline, before memory starts to slip. She looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and Michael quickly followed. By asking whether I had spoken to an attorney about such matters, I laughed nervously, attempting to deflect, but the message had been delivered. This was no casual dinner conversation, it was a reconnaissance mission. The grandchildren whispered to each other when they thought I was not listening, and I caught one of them saying, "Dad said Grandpa's rich now." The words stung like a lash. They explained more than anything else could have, reducing 2 decades of absence to a single motive. I tried to steady myself, sipping wine, telling stories of Ellen, of Michael as a boy, but no one asked me to continue. No one lingered on those memories as though they belonged to a distant stranger, rather than to their own family history. The food was plentiful, but it lodged in my throat, and I found myself nodding politely, while inside my heart sank deeper with every passing minute. Later, as dessert was served, Michael leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. He told me how glad he was that I had come, how much it meant to him, and yet beneath those words I could sense an urgency, a calculation. He asked again about my house, about my plans for the future, about whether I felt safe managing things alone. He mentioned that I should not be burdened with complicated paperwork at my age, that it might be wise to let him handle such matters. His words were wrapped in concern, but the intent felt heavier, like chains disguised as garlands. I smiled weakly, thanked him for his thoughtfulness, and changed the subject, though my stomach churned with unease. By the time coffee was poured, I understood with clarity what my heart had resisted admitting from the moment the phone rang weeks earlier. This was not a homecoming born of love, nor a reconciliation sparked by regret. This was a transaction dressed as forgiveness, a careful performance designed to make me pliable, to convince me that the son who had ignored me for 20 years now saw value in me again, not because I was his father, but because I was suddenly worth something in dollars. The realization pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe, but I said nothing, because loneliness is a cunning enemy, and even counterfeit affection can feel intoxicating when you have been starved of it for so long. I sat among them, smiling as though I believed in the warmth of the evening, while inside I felt the cold recognition that the first cracks in this fragile reunion had already begun to spread, and that the night would not end without further fractures. The evening deepened, and with it came a subtle tightening of the air, the kind that is felt not in words but in the weight of glances exchanged across a room. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that after dinner there might be some genuine closeness, that the barrier of years would soften as we lingered with coffee and pie. But instead I began to feel as though I were on trial. Each sentence I spoke met with an assessing look, each gesture quietly observed as if being recorded for some ledger I could not see. Michael sat across from me with the practiced smile of a man who wanted to project warmth, yet whose eyes betrayed a sharper calculation. And Linda moved gracefully around the table, filling cups and offering slices, her voice always polite, but her tone edged with a peculiar condescension, as though speaking to someone fragile who might break at the wrong touch. The grandchildren had retreated to their phones, occasionally glancing at me with curiosity more than affection, and when one of them laughed at a message on his screen, I wondered if perhaps my presence was being discussed even then in the private. corridors of their devices. It was during this uneasy quiet that Michael steered the conversation to the subject of property and planning, no longer veiled in the light-hearted anecdotes of earlier, but direct, pressing. He spoke of how complicated it had been to settle his wife's uncle's estate, how awful it was to watch assets get tied up in courts, how much better it would have been if clear instructions had been written long before. His words were delivered as a universal observation, but his gaze never left me, heavy and insistent. He asked, with a tone that pretended to be casual, whether I had drawn up a will, whether I had spoken to anyone about my house, my accounts, my intentions for the future. He chuckled lightly when I hesitated, remarking that these things become more urgent at our age, and that it would be irresponsible to leave everything disorganized. I felt my chest tighten as I realized the evening had turned a corner from suspicion into something undeniable. What had masqueraded as reconciliation was now plainly exposed as interrogation, the dinner a stage for Michael to confirm what he wanted to know, how much I had, what I planned to do with it, and whether he would be written into the script of my final years. The air seemed to grow colder, though the fire crackled in the hearth, and I struggled to maintain composure, to respond without anger, but my voice shook as I told him I had not made firm plans, that I was in no hurry to think of death. He smiled at that, shaking his head as if I were being childishly stubborn, and Linda touched his arm with a look of encouragement, whispering that I ought to think of the family, that surely I wanted to protect them from confusion. For a moment I felt dizzy, as though the walls of the room had tilted, and I excused myself under the pretense of needing the restroom. In truth, I sought air, a reprieve from the suffocating weight of their scrutiny, and I slipped out the back door onto the porch, where the night was sharp with winter chill. Snow dusted the ground, glittering beneath the streetlights, and I stood there with my breath rising in pale clouds, gripping the railing as though it were the only solid thing left. Inside, I could still hear faint laughter, the clinking of plates, but out here I allowed myself to sag beneath the knowledge that the reunion I had long dreamed of was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed play in which I was both guest and target. As I stared into the darkness, I remembered the night Ellen and I first brought Michael home from the hospital, how tiny he had been in the crook of her arm, how we had whispered promises to protect him, to love him, to never let him feel unwanted. That memory cut deep now, because standing on his porch, invited not as a father, but as a bank account in human form, I realized those promises had been kept only on one side. When I finally returned inside, the atmosphere had shifted further, the children gone to bed, the adults gathered in the living room where the conversation turned openly to finances. Michael spoke of his mortgage, of the costs of tuition, of how difficult it had been to maintain the lifestyle they had built, and though he never explicitly asked for money, the implication sat heavy in every pause. Linda leaned forward with her polite smile, suggesting that family ought to help one another, that my sudden good fortune could be used to strengthen bonds that had frayed. I sat silently, nodding where expected, but inside I knew with a clarity that could no longer be avoided. This was not reconciliation, it was exploitation, and the stakes were higher than sentiment. That night, lying awake in the guest room they had prepared for me, a room neat but impersonal, I stared at the ceiling and confronted the truth I had resisted for weeks. My son had not invited me back into his life out of love or regret. He had done so because word of my wealth had reached him, and he saw in me an opportunity. It was a realization both devastating and liberating, for it stripped away the last illusions I had clung to. There would be no genuine healing here, no restoration of the bond I once believed unbreakable. There was only a negotiation disguised as family, and I would have to decide how to respond. The next morning, the house was filled with the scents of breakfast: coffee, bacon, toasted bread. But beneath the domestic comfort there was a tension so taut it seemed to hum in the walls. I came downstairs slowly, my joints stiff from a restless night spent turning over the same realization again and again, that I was not here as a father welcomed home, but as a man whose fortune had suddenly made him valuable. Michael greeted me with a brisk cheerfulness that felt rehearsed, clapping me on the shoulder as though we had shared a night of laughter rather than an evening thick with veiled interrogations. Linda poured me coffee without asking how I liked it, pressing the cup into my hands with a smile that seemed almost maternal in its surface gentleness, but patronizing in its undertone, as though I were already incapable of pouring for myself. I sipped and said nothing, watching the way Michael scanned me with quick glances, studying whether I looked tired, whether my hand trembled, whether I seemed confused, as though he were building a case in his head that I was no longer fit to manage. My own life, the grandchildren entered in pajamas, yawning, carrying their phones, barely acknowledging me, though one of them gave me a curious glance that lingered longer than the others. I wondered if in some private corner of their hearts there was still room for something genuine, or if the lessons of distance and whispered comments about my wealth had already hardened them against me. We sat at the table, the four of us, and the conversation began again almost immediately, circling back to the subject of planning for the future, of making life easier, of ensuring that family assets did not slip away into the hands of strangers. Michael told me, with the confidence of someone who believed he had the right to direct me, that he had spoken with an attorney about setting up a trust, that it was the wisest thing for men my age, that I ought to sign over certain responsibilities. Now, before things became more complicated, his tone was light, but the insistence was unmistakable, and Linda reinforced it by telling me that it was what her father had done, and how smoothly everything had gone as a result. I felt my stomach turn as I realized they had prepared for this conversation long before I even set foot in their house. The dinner the night before had been the opening act, a gentle probing, but now they moved with more confidence, presenting their ideas as if they were foregone conclusions. Michael even slid a folder across the table, papers neatly arranged inside, telling me it was nothing binding yet, only drafts for me to look over. But I could see the hunger in his eyes as he urged me to open it. I placed my hands flat on the cover and did not look inside. I told him I would consider it, that I would take my time, that there was no urgency. He smiled tightly, masking his irritation, and Linda changed the subject with forced brightness. But the message had been delivered. They were no longer content to hint, they were making their demands clear. The day unfolded with a series of small humiliations that cut more deeply because they were disguised as care. Linda insisted on accompanying me whenever I moved from one room to another, asking if I needed help with the stairs, reminding me to take my pills though I had not asked her, suggesting I lie down for a nap as if I were a child overstimulated by company. Michael corrected me when I referred to a neighbor from years ago, telling me with a patronizing laugh that I was confusing names, though I knew I was not. Every error they could invent or exaggerate, they seized upon, weaving a subtle narrative that I was slipping, that I was not quite capable, that perhaps I required guidance. It dawned on me with icy clarity that they were not simply after my money. They were preparing the groundwork to declare me unfit, to make me dependent on them by legal authority, to take control not through inheritance after my death, but through guardianship while I still breathed. That evening, a few guests joined for a holiday gathering, neighbors of Michael and Linda, people who greeted me politely but with the distance of strangers. The wine flowed, conversations swirled, and I sat in a chair by the fire, listening more than speaking, watching as my son performed his version of the dutiful child, introducing me with exaggerated warmth, telling everyone how glad he was that I had finally joined them for Christmas. Yet when the talk turned casual, he allowed small remarks to slip, telling one man that I sometimes got mixed up about details, telling another that I had not managed the upkeep of my house very well, chuckling about how I was set in my ways. They laughed, taking it as ordinary banter, but I heard it for what it was, a careful public planting of seeds, building a perception that I was a kindly but fading old man, unreliable with facts, incapable of handling affairs, a man who would need a steady hand to guide him. At one point, I rose to pour myself another cup of coffee, and Linda hurried across the room to intercept me, gently taking the pot from my hands with a smile, telling me she would do it, that I ought to sit and rest. The gesture might have seemed benign to others, but I felt the sting of it as a declaration of my supposed incompetence, a performance for the room to see, as though to say, "Look how we must care for him." When I returned to my chair, I noticed 2 of the neighbours nodding approvingly at Linda, their eyes full of sympathy not for me, but for the burden they imagined she bore. Later, after the guests departed and the house quieted, Michael closed the door to his study and asked me to join him. I entered reluctantly, and he motioned for me to sit across from his desk, where another set of papers lay waiting. He spoke more directly now, his voice firm, telling me he understood I might feel hesitant, that old pride often got in the way, but that it was best for everyone if I entrusted him with managing my affairs. He said it as though it were already decided, his tone not of request but of persuasion bordering on command. He reminded me of the difficulties he had endured when his wife's relatives passed without leaving clear instructions, of how much strife it caused, of how families can be torn apart by disputes. I sat silently, my eyes fixed on the polished wood of the desk, feeling both fury and sorrow twist inside me. Finally, I told him I needed more time, that I could not make such decisions on the spot. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger break through the practiced mask. He warned me gently, but unmistakably, that waiting too long could have consequences, that confusion only grows worse with age, that mistakes become irreversible. When I left the study, my hands trembled, and I went to the guest room to sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards. I realized then that I was caught in a dangerous game, that the people who bore my blood were no longer acting as family, but as predators circling an inheritance not yet granted, willing to manipulate me, to twist perception, to paint me as incapable, if it served their purpose. The house, with its cheerful decorations and festive scents, had become a cage, and I was the animal placed inside for observation until I yielded what they wanted. In the days that followed, their pressure grew more insistent. Michael asked me directly at breakfast whether I had thought about the papers. Linda reminded me that it would be selfish not to prepare, and even one of the grandchildren casually asked if I would be moving closer soon so that Dad could help you with your stuff. The collusion was unmistakable. Every detail of my behavior was monitored, every hesitation noted, every word weighed. They wanted me to believe that surrender was inevitable, that resistance was foolish. But inside me, something else stirred, something I had not felt in years. A stubborn fire, the same one that had carried me through decades of factory work, the same one that had allowed me to endure 20 years of silence without completely collapsing. I realized that though they saw me as weak, as pliable, as desperate for affection, they had underestimated the resilience that loneliness forges. On Christmas night, as the family gathered once more around the table, I sat among them with my heart pounding, watching as Michael reached again for the folder of documents he wished me to sign. Linda spoke with a soothing tone about how this would make things easier, how I would no longer have to worry, how they would take care of everything. The grandchildren looked on, more interested in dessert than in my answer, but I knew the moment was decisive. They believed they had cornered me, that I would yield at last under the combined weight of their persuasion. Yet as I listened, I felt something harden within me, a decision forming that I would not tell them yet, but that would determine everything that followed. For though they believed they had me ensnared, I knew that the very greed which had brought them back into my life would also be the thing that gave me the power to sever them once and for all. The culmination of all the tension that had been carefully cultivated over the days of my visit arrived on Christmas night, though not in the way Michael or Linda had imagined it. The table was once again filled with food, the kind of abundance that seems designed less to nourish than to impress. Every dish perfectly arranged, every glass filled, every candle lit so that the house glowed with festive warmth. Laughter came easily to the others, but for me it sounded hollow, as though the cheer existed only on the surface, a performance for the occasion. I sat quietly, responding politely when addressed, sipping my wine with deliberate slowness, all the while aware that they were circling toward the moment they had been building to since the phone call weeks earlier. My heart pounded with a strange mixture of dread and determination, because I knew that what was about to happen would define the rest of my life, whether I remained their captive or freed myself from their grasp once and for all. After dessert was cleared, Michael leaned back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone who believed the stage was set. He thanked everyone for coming, raised his glass in a brief toast to family, then turned his gaze directly to me, his expression one of solemn care, though I could see the eagerness flickering in his eyes. He spoke of how wonderful it was to have me there, how meaningful it was to be reunited after so many years, and how important it was not to lose sight of what truly mattered. His words, though cloaked in affection, carried the unmistakable cadence of an introduction to the subject that had consumed him since my arrival. And indeed, within moments he pivoted to it, telling me gently but firmly that the time had come to make decisions, that nothing would be more tragic than to allow the confusion of the future to undo the harmony of the present. Linda, seated at his side, placed her hand upon his as if in support, her smile serene and maternal, her voice soft as she spoke of responsibility, of clarity, of the peace of mind that comes with knowing everything is in order. She told me that she and Michael had discussed it at length, that they wanted to relieve me of the burdens that came with property, with finances, with legalities, that I deserved to enjoy my remaining years free of such worries. She gestured to the folder that had been set discreetly beside Michael's chair, and though she did not touch it, the implication was as sharp as if she had shoved it across the table toward me. I looked at the faces around me, at the grandchildren who watched in bored silence, barely comprehending the significance of the exchange, at Michael who leaned forward now, urging me with his gaze, at Linda whose eyes gleamed with certainty that they had worn me down enough to secure my compliance. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter, the air heavy, my pulse hammering in my ears. For a long moment I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, and I could sense their impatience growing, their confidence that I was wavering. But then, with deliberate calm, I reached into my coat pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table in front of me. They froze, eyes fixed on it, and for a moment I saw triumph flash across Michael's face, as though he believed I had already done what he wanted, that I had brought the very documents he had been pressing for, perhaps even a will already written. His hand twitched as though to seize it, but I held up my palm and told him to wait. Slowly, with all eyes upon me, I pushed the envelope towards him, and with a voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, I said that inside he would find the answer to all his questions. His fingers fumbled slightly as he opened it, pulling out the sheaf of papers within, but as his eyes scanned the words, the expression on his face changed from eager expectation to shock, and then to anger. What he held in his hands was not a will naming him sole heir, nor a trust granting him control of my estate, but a signed statement prepared by my attorney weeks earlier, one that declared in explicit legal language that the majority of my wealth, including the winnings from the lottery, would be placed in a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting community libraries and local schools, with only a modest portion reserved for my own care. Furthermore, it contained a clause explicitly excluding him from any direct claim to the money, citing estrangement of more than 20 years and lack of filial responsibility. It was not merely a denial of what he wanted. It was a deliberate closure of the door he had worked so hard to force open. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. Michael's face reddened, his jaw tightening as his eyes burned into me with disbelief and fury. Linda's composure cracked, her polite mask slipping as she gasped, demanding to know what this meant, how I could do such a thing. The grandchildren looked from one face to another, confused, uneasy, aware at last that something monumental was occurring. I took a slow sip of wine, placed the glass carefully down, and spoke in a voice that was calm but unyielding. I told them that I had come here hoping, despite all reason, that perhaps time had changed things, that perhaps there was still love left between us. But what I had found instead was a hunger so naked it had stripped away the last illusions. I told them that I would not be manipulated, that my life's worth was not measured in dollars, and that the fortune I had stumbled upon would not become the chain by which they sought to bind me. Michael slammed the folder shut, his voice rising as he accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of abandoning family for strangers. Linda's words cut sharper, accusing me of selfishness, of destroying the future of my own grandchildren. I listened, but their fury washed over me without breaking the resolve that had hardened inside me. I told them quietly that family is not built on inheritance, that love is not proven by signatures on documents, and that the years of silence had already testified to where their hearts truly lay. They demanded explanations, they shouted, but I remained seated, steady, watching as their performance collapsed into raw anger. Finally, when their rage had exhausted itself into bitter silence, I rose from the table, took my coat from the back of the chair, and told them that this was the last time I would sit at their table. I thanked them for the meal, wished them a Merry Christmas, and with deliberate dignity walked to the door. Behind me I heard Linda's choked sobs, Michael's muttered curses, the grandchildren whispering in confusion. But I did not turn back. Stepping into the cold night air, I felt the sting of winter on my face, but also a strange warmth within, the warmth of a man who had chosen dignity over surrender, who had refused to be used even at the cost of blood ties. For the first time in many years, I felt the weight in my chest lift, not because I had regained my family, but because I had finally let go of the illusion that they had ever intended to return to me. The walk from their house to my car felt longer than it was, as though each step was carrying me not only away from the porch lights and the muffled voices inside, but also away from 2 decades of yearning that had held me captive. The night was crisp, the snow crunching beneath my shoes, and when I reached the car and closed the door, I sat for a long moment in silence, gripping the wheel, listening to the echo of their shouts still ringing faintly in my ears. My hands trembled, but it was not from weakness. It was from the surge of release that coursed through me, the strange mixture of sorrow and relief that comes when the truth, however brutal, finally stands naked and undeniable. I had not regained a son that evening, but I had regained myself, the part of me that had long been shackled by hope, by the desperate hunger for reconciliation, by the illusion that time and money might heal wounds that had long since festered beyond repair. Driving back through the quiet streets, past houses glowing with holiday lights and windows filled with families gathered in warmth, I did not feel envy as I once had. Instead, I felt something closer to acceptance. Those lights belonged to others, to lives built on different choices, and I no longer needed to measure my own worth against them. My road was solitary, yes, but it was mine, and it stretched before me now, without the heavy weight of false expectation. For years I had clung to the fantasy that one day Michael might return, that one day I might sit at his table as a father again, but the encounter had burned that fantasy away, leaving me with a clarity as sharp as the winter air. In the weeks that followed, I found a new rhythm to my days. I met with my lawyer and finalized the details of the foundation I had established, ensuring that the money which had poisoned the air between my son and me would instead nourish places of learning and community, libraries and schools where children could discover voices and stories that might save them from bitterness. For the first time, writing my name on those papers felt like planting something instead of burying it, and I left the office lighter than I had entered. At home, I cleared out closets, sorted through Ellen's belongings, placed boxes of books and old clothes into my trunk, and drove them to the local community centre, where volunteers received them with gratitude. Their smiles were uncalculated, their thanks untainted by expectation. And I realized how long it had been since I had been looked at not as a resource to be claimed, but as a person who mattered. Neighbours began to notice the change in me. Ruth from across the street invited me to join her family for Sunday supper, and though at first I hesitated, unsure if I belonged in anyone's circle anymore, I eventually accepted. Sitting at her table, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, I laughed at their small arguments and their teasing, not because I mistook them for my own, but because their joy reminded me that family can take forms beyond blood. The emptiness in my house no longer seemed a tomb, but a quiet place I could leave and return to by choice rather than by exile. I even took a small trip, driving to Colorado to see the mountains Ellen and I had once promised each other we would visit again. Standing at a lookout, the wind whipping at my coat, I whispered her name and felt, if only for a moment, that she was beside me, proud that I had chosen dignity over surrender. As for Michael, he did not call again. I knew he would not, and I no longer waited for the phone to ring. Perhaps one day he would come to regret the choices he had made. Perhaps not, but his path was his own, and I could no longer twist myself into knots over what might have been. The last tie had been cut that Christmas night, and though the severing had been painful, it was also final, and in that finality there was a strange peace. For 20 years I had been both prisoner and supplicant, longing for a reconciliation that never came. But now I stood outside that prison, free to spend my final years not as a man begging for scraps of affection, but as a man who understood his own worth. On the following Christmas, I did not sit alone with canned soup and an old radio. Instead, I volunteered at the community centre's holiday dinner, serving plates of food to strangers who smiled at me with gratitude that was simple and uncalculated. Children tugged at my sleeve, asking for stories, and I told them small pieces of my past, careful not to let the bitterness seep through, choosing instead to give them laughter and warmth. When the evening ended and I walked back to my car beneath the glow of streetlights, I felt a quiet satisfaction that I had not felt in years. I had not been restored to the family I once longed for, but I had found something else. A life no longer defined by rejection, but by choice, by the ability to give freely where giving was welcome. And so my story closed not with the fairy tale of reconciliation, but with the harder, truer ending of acceptance. I had lost a son long ago, but in losing him finally and completely, I had regained the dignity of a man who chooses where to place his love. And I knew as I turned the key in the ignition and the car hummed to life, that the road ahead, though shorter than the one behind, would be mine to travel on my own terms.